any newspaper, watch any TV show, and the world looks like a rough place that's only getting worse. Gun-related deaths in the United States are rising. Climate change increasingly poses a threat. More and more jobs are lost to automation, racial tensions are at a fever pitch, and authoritarianism is on the march across the globe. And the internet doesn't seem to be helping any of this. But are these short-term statistics misleading? And is life today actually better than it was 100, 200, 500 years ago? Here today to discuss a more optimistic view of the present is Steven Pinker, the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. He just wrote a book called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Steve, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to hit you with a little statistic.
Okay.
A couple statistics. Now, 700 million people live in extreme poverty, and 2+ billion are under the oppression of autocratic governments. A sixth of the world is illiterate. What possibly can we celebrate?
Oh, the fact that those numbers used to be much, much worse. Illiteracy.
They were higher.
Much higher, that's right. The rate of extreme poverty, in particular, has gone down by about 3/4 just in 30 years. This is, many economists say this is one of the greatest achievements of the human species ever, and virtually no one knows about it. Likewise, literacy. 90% of the world's population under the age of 25 can read and write. For most of human history, it was more like 10 to 15%. In fact, most of human history, it was 0 because we're a naturally illiterate species. But even after print was widespread, the typical literacy rate, even in Europe, was 15% until the 18th century. Universal literacy wasn't achieved until the 20th century in the West. Worldwide, the literacy rate was about 10 or 15% for most of modern history, and then it began to shoot up a number of decades ago.
What about danger? What about murder rates and things like that?
And murder rates, especially in the United States, the murder rate has been cut by more than half.
Since when?
Since the Great American Crime Decline began in 1992 after almost 3 decades of sky-high crime rates, which were reflected in popular culture. There are a lot of TV shows and movies about how you couldn't walk in Central Park without taking your life into your hands. People had these steel bars to prop their doors closed so there wouldn't be a home invasion. There were TV programs like Hill Street Blues and movies like Bonfire of the Vanities that were all about the backdrop of urban crime. Then it plunged, a 75% decline in New York, which used to be considered a combat zone. In fact, Boston had an area called the combat zone. I live in it now.
Where's that?
That is downtown.
Oh,
it's
really?
where the department stores are. And
it was
the
just
theaters.
that dangerous.
It was called the combat zone because it was dangerous, yeah. And that's gone way down. As have worldwide, the rates of homicide have come down just in the last 20 years, and the rate of death in war has come way down. It was about 22 per 100,000 per year in the early 1950s. Then it went down to about 9 during the era of the Vietnam War, around 5 in the 1980s, and now it's down about 1 per 100,000 per year.
Those feel like things to celebrate, and typically I like to introduce our snack at the end of the show, but given that those are things we should celebrate, and given that your favorite snack is beer and warm nuts, I think we should break it out.
We'll drink to that. We'll drink to human progress.
Absolutely.
Okay, yes.
Drink to progress. Mike, thank you so much. All right, so we've got 2 things here. 3 things. We've got beer, Sam Adams Boston Lager. This is your choice.
Yes. A little bit of ambivalence.
Okay.
It's originally a local beer.
Yes.
Boston Lager. Samuel Adams, a New England patriot. It was the first real craft beer, first micro brewery beer in the mid-1980s. I immediately developed a taste for it. I like it, and it's local. A little bit of ambivalence because just 2 weeks ago, the founder of the brewery, Jim Koch, praised Donald Trump and his tax cuts. So I posed a moral dilemma for me.
This is to the product then, not the company.
Right, yes. Well, I decided 2 things. One is I really like the beer.
Yeah.
And number 2 is I don't think the world cares what brand of beer Steven Pinker drinks. So I'm going to drink it in good conscience.
Okay, well, cheers.
Cheers, thank you.
To
human progress.
To human progress. Now on the warm nuts side.
Yes.
We have Whole Foods warm nuts, and we have Aroop's homemade home roasted nuts
Oh.
and seasoned. These are just almonds and cashews. Those are, I believe, almonds, cashews, Brazil nuts, and macadamia. So you may.
Oh, well, I
Pick
go,
your-
go with the home seasoned. Yes, when you're occasionally, every once in a while, a host will pay for me to fly business class or
Yeah.
first class. And it's not really not worth the money, except the one great luxury is they will often serve you a little ramekin of hot nuts.
Yeah.
Now, those are the most expensive hot nuts that anyone will ever consume.
You can't ever find them anywhere else. Those are the only places you can find them.
Well, it feels that way, but
Yeah.
it's anyway a little luxury that you can replicate at home with a little can of Planters and a toaster oven.
Can I blow your mind real quick? Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen a picture of a cashew?
Don't think I have.
Okay.
I mean, in its natural state.
Gotta check that out.
My goodness,
That's a cashew.
the green part is what we eat.
I believe so. Is that nuts?
That's nuts. Yeah, that is nuts.
Yeah. So I see that. So I mean, anything to kind of remind you of a more luxurious time, I can get behind.
Yeah, I mean, they're expensive nuts, but but I enjoy it when I can.
All right. Let's continue to drink and eat, but let's move on to the book. Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Now, Bill Gates has called this his new favorite book. How much did you have to pay him to say that? He didn't get rich on his own.
I couldn't afford it. If I had to ask, I couldn't afford it. Yeah.
I mean, walk me. And he's a big fan. He says, he a lot of the things you said earlier, he not only believes them, but also has been part of the process to encourage those statistics. What is the main argument of the book?
The main argument is that there is a coherent system of beliefs and values that is an alternative to nationalism and tribalism and religious fundamentalism and reactionary thinking and Marxism that has faded into the background. So most people have forgotten what it is. It goes by a number of names, sometimes called the open society, cosmopolitanism, secular humanism, liberalism, classical liberalism. I identify it with the values of the Enlightenment, which I then identify in the subtitle as reason, science, humanism, and progress. And the idea is that if we use reason and science toward the goal of making human beings better off, we can gradually succeed. And that this is a noble moral purpose.
Yeah.
And it
succeed,
is
but what do you mean by succeed?
that is make people better off.
Better
that is
off.
give people longer lives, healthier lives, more education, greater
Prosperity.
happiness, greater prosperity, greater opportunities to enjoy nature, culture, and family and friends, greater freedom. That it's the goods in life are really not all that controversial. Now, there are other possible goods, salvation, honor, heroic greatness, but regardless of what you think about those transcendent values, health, happiness, education, culture, that's a pretty good start.
Yeah.
And the world agrees on them. We have them enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is a worthy purpose. I personally don't think that we need extra stuff like salvation in an afterlife. And it's not a romantic vision. It is attainable. And we have made progress at reducing violence and illiteracy and oppression and ignorance. And we should identify what it is that has succeeded and do more of it.
So the book is it's a description and it's an explanation. It's a description of, hey, the world is not as bad as we think, or it's not going in as bad of a direction as people think.
Exactly.
There are still problems we have to deal with. And second is that these are the reasons why. There's this thing called reason. There's this thing called humanism and technology and education. These come together and mix. And as humans also interact more, they have a growing sense of empathy, and that is what has produced this progress, which I call progress. Is that
Yes, exactly right.
Does it feel ironic at all to have to use reason to defend reason?
Yes, well, there is the fact that you use reason to defend anything is itself a defense of reason. That is, it almost doesn't need a defense if you think clearly. It is, as soon as you try to argue for any alternative to reason, you've lost the argument.
Yeah.
Because you're using reason. You're saying, I'm not full of crap, you should believe me, there are good reasons to believe me. As soon as you start playing that game, you have acknowledged that reason is the way in which we should come to an understanding of the world.
But reason also doesn't lead to one solution, right? So people have different definitions of happiness. People have different definitions of prosperity, ownership over their lives, etc. Is it true that reason will lead them in a single direction? I mean, it feels like it can be more complicated, and these can interfere and conflict with each other, and what we might think of as a better life for somebody may not quite be what that person thinks.
It is true that reason by itself doesn't tell you what you should reason toward. It's a way of going from true premises to true conclusions, but in terms of attaining goals, the goals have to come from someplace else. That's where the humanism comes in. And it is true that there can be some disagreement as to what we should strive for, particularly if it's bringing the kingdom of God to earth and obeying his commandments, or achieving national greatness, or feats of nobility. On the other hand, it's surprising how much consensus there is that life is better than death, and freedom is better than coercion, and abundance is better than want, and health is better than sickness, and knowledge is better than ignorance. Just as a practical matter, when the world has to come together and agree on anything, the result is not the empty set. The result is actually quite a long list of human goods. That's the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's not a coincidence, because these goods, while they're not logically justified by reason, it's not a big leap. That is, the idea that it's better to be alive than dead. Well, if you're dead, you can't even really be arguing for anything. So the very fact that we're here arguing implies that life is good. It's a prerequisite to everything else. Once you say that life is a good, then you have to say that health is a good, because you can't be alive if you're deathly ill. It also means, given that we're physical creatures, that sustenance is important, because all complex entities require energy to resist the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, things falling apart. It puts a value on knowledge, because we can't have an intelligent discussion unless we know something about the world that we're arguing about. And so on. A lot of things follow just from the requirement that we're here debating anything in the first place.
Yeah. Now, this book really is a sequel to an earlier book that you wrote, which is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, which you go through so much in this book. Many of the same sort of ideas and graphs you use, you explain in this second book, which is you get into more of the philosophical underpinnings of why this is the case, why we're living in this better world. Now, but this book was, including index, 802 pages, and your new one is only 556. Why did you write such a short book?
There was partly because the Enlightenment Now could build on The Better Angels of Our Nature. The Better Angels of Our Nature was long not only because it covered both history and psychology, including neuroscience, so it tried to first document the fact that violence has declined over the course of history, and tried to explain it. Now, in saying that violence has declined, that does not mean that there has been some linear or monotonic or steady decline in all forms of violence. I mean, that would be kind of mystical or miraculous. Different kinds of violence declined at different rates in different periods for different causes. The decline in interpersonal violence, homicide, and assault was a phenomenon that began in the Middle Ages in England. The decline of war much later. War didn't really start to decline until.
And this is interstate war. This is not the same as civil war, right?
That's right. And those two are on different timelines. Yeah. Interstate war has declined much more drastically than civil war. There are basically no interstate wars going on right now.
Between major powers.
Between any two, war in the sense of the old-fashioned idea of two uniformed armies facing each other on the battlefield, each one from a nation state.
Sure.
That is obsolescent. There's still civil wars, and the worst civil wars do have external intervention, Syria being a prototype.
There's also Sudan, South Sudan. There are some, I guess that was,
also
came from a
civil
single,
war.
it's sort of hiding. Now they're technically two, but 10 years ago they weren't two different countries.
True. Although, and even then, it's classified as a civil war with external intervention.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
But anyway, deaths in war from all kinds have declined, even with the worst war in a generation, namely the Syrian civil war. And that was a later decline than the decline of homicide. And in between, there was the abolition of forms of institutionalized violence, like slavery, like capital punishment, like cruel forms of torture, execution, such as burning at the stake or disemboweling. And so there were different timelines. I had to document each one in the teeth of incredulity that each one happened, which I tried to establish with the use of quantitative databases. And then I had to explain it. And the explanation had to appeal to human neuroscience, that is, what circuits in the brain make us violent and what circuits in the brain make us refrain from violence.
Which is your expertise,
which is where I came from in the first place. Yeah.
Right?
But then also you had to bring the explanation couldn't possibly just come from psychology and neuroscience, because that would, since our biology hasn't changed over the decades and centuries, if it was just an explanation in terms of how the brain worked, you'd expect rates of violence to be constant. So you had to bring the history together with the cognitive science and neuroscience to try to explain what aspects of the environment, what social norms, what laws, what constraints engaged in different proportions the different parts of the brain. Anyway, that adds up to a long book.
The thesis of Better Angels of Our Nature are that we have inner demons and better angels, right?
Exactly.
And so we have, you've also wrote a book called Blank Slate. You've written many, many books. But it's this idea that human nature is consistent. We have bad things and good things, and there are institutions and environmental causes that can push us in one direction or another.
Exactly. Yeah.
And these institutions over time have been strengthened, and so these norms have changed around. I mean, if we call norms institutions, it's a sort of institution. And those change over time such that they are able to not necessarily not change human nature, but that they're able to prevent some of those inner demons.
Yeah, they engage different parts of human nature.
That's right.
Exactly. That's why I love the title, which I stole from Abraham Lincoln, The Better Angels of Our Nature, a poetic way of implying that human nature is complex, that has multiple voices, multiple systems, and that some of them are better than others.
Yeah, there are a couple things about that I feel like are people you're known as an optimist. However, I think there's a pessimism here as well, built in that precisely that these institutions are required. Means something has depth to how you think things would be otherwise.
Completely right, and that is, in fact, I don't think I am by intellectual temperament an optimist. The Blank Slate was seen as at least a tragic vision, if not a pessimistic vision, namely that since the mind is not a blank slate, social programmers can't simply design an environment that makes us noble and good and wise, because we have inherited from the processes of evolution some rather nasty and self-defeating traits. But it was a comment that I made in The Better Angels to stave off the most fatalistic, most pessimistic interpretation of human nature. Namely, we're just doomed to conflict forever, and if you want to work for peace or nonviolence, then you're a starry-eyed dreamer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good for John and Yoko and Peter, Paul, and Mary, but it'll never work in the world. And even in The Blank Slate, I noted, well, that's a non sequitur, because human nature is complex.
Yeah.
If we're not blank slates, that means there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
And while some impulses make us violent, like the thirst for revenge, the desire for dominance, the ability to shut off our empathy and exploit people in clear conscience. But then there are other parts of human nature that constrain those impulses, like empathy, like self-control, like reason, like norms. I noted back in the Blank Slate that we know from history that humans are not doomed to a constant level of violence, because we have examples of violence declining that I sort of tossed out then, such as the abolition of slavery, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, I mentioned the decline of homicide in England since the Middle Ages. And then it was when I repeated those observations in a blog post that I got correspondence from political scientists and criminologists and sociologists and historians saying, you could have added many more examples of violence declining over the course of history. That was a revelation because these came from scattered, diverse areas of scholarship that they didn't talk to each other. Their results are not widely known among educated people in general. They paint a picture that is very different from the one that you get from the news, which of course concentrates on all the violence that remains. It doesn't cover the violence that doesn't occur, that would have occurred if life was the way it was several decades or centuries ago. And I realized this is a story that needs to be told, both in terms of sharing this pattern that I was fortunate enough to come across, and as a psychologist to try to explain it. And then after I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, I had another round of epiphanies that it wasn't just violence where the human condition had improved, but pretty much every other aspect of human existence, such as poverty, such as disease, such as illiteracy.
Is there a possibility that these urges, that these inner demons are getting channeled to other things? I mean, sometimes it's, in your book, or reading your book, we're less tribal in some sense. And then I think, well, Steve, have you ever been to a Patriots game?
Yes, right.
Or a Red Sox game?
Well, one of the...
Are they being channeled somewhere else?
It's not, I don't think they're channeled in the kind of Freudian sense that there's a hydraulic drive, that if it is not released through some channels, it'll build up and eventually burst. But I think there are sources of human gratification and pleasure and enjoyment. Tribalism indeed is one, and sports is a benign way of indulging that impulse.
But you don't see it as getting it out of your system. That's not something that you
I don't see
buy
it
into that.
No, that's right. That is, I don't think that sports fans, for example, are more pacifistic than people who can't release their bellicose impulses toward sports.
Or it could be that there are certain people with bellicose instinct or impulses, and there are people with less bellicose instincts, and those who have bellicose instincts need to channel it somewhere.
I think that's probably closer to the truth. Yeah. But yeah, I do think that the benign cultural institutions speak to our needs and can allow us to indulge in them in non-destructive ways, sports being a great example.
What about the collective? Individuals, you mentioned individual homicides and dueling and slavery and things are norms that no longer are acceptable in pretty much the entire world, with some rare exceptions. But when people get together, there can be a mob mentality.
Yeah.
People can do really bad things. And Nazism was not that long ago.
Yeah.
We're only 70, 80 years out. So, is that something that, are we one more movement away from disrupting, the average of life getting better? Are we, is there an easy slide for especially collective and mob mentalities?
There is a slide, and we don't know how easy it is. Of course, in the era of Trump, there is kind of a school of concern, fear that we're taking steps in that direction. And in some ways we are, toward tribalism, toward authoritarianism, toward an erosion of the democratic checks and balances. So far, we have not spiraled down into Nazism, and I think that it would be hyperbole to say that we're close. There are moves in that direction that are disconcerting to me. I like to think that our current norms and institutions are, even though they're getting a stress test, but they're strong enough to resist them. I frankly doubt, and I don't think it's just an optimistic temperament, that the country's going to turn into Nazi Germany in the next 2 years or even 6 years. But it is something that we have to be vigilant about.
Related to that, the idea of a nuclear attack or something, that a huge amount of loss of life. Because this book is about it's trends. It's about averages. Things on average, or in aggregate, I should say, are better today than they were 100 years ago. But precisely the events not homicides, but wars in particular, those are rare events that happen in huge numbers. So there's kind of spikes, so to speak. And I was wondering if we are, one nuclear attack or one, great power war with China or Russia away from from totally disrupting that average?
Yeah, it could happen, and in The Better Angels of Our Nature, I have a pretty lengthy discussion of the statistics of wars, including the fact that wars fall into what's called a fat-tailed distribution or a thick-tailed distribution, where the most catastrophic events are unlikely, but they're not astronomically unlikely. So yeah, we very much have to worry about them. It's not the case that the detonation of one nuclear weapon would lead to the end of the species or would inevitably escalate. Nonetheless, I do think that the risks are too high, that like a number of people, not just peaceniks, but even Cold War hawks like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, I think that we should aim toward the abolition of all nuclear weapons.
Right.
Of course, this is an idea that was famously articulated by Ronald Reagan, of all people. He was kind of ridiculed at the time.
Also Kissinger, I think, also before he became on this train, advocated for battlefield nuclear attacks, I think, and the tactical nukes.
I don't know if he ever explicitly advocated that, but but certainly it is true that the global zero is a turn in his life.
That's right.
And certainly when he was secretary.
But you see that also as an explanatory variable, but really it's because you go back earlier than the 1940s. You say that life has gotten better on average for hundreds of years. So
although in different time scales for different aspects
reasons.
of
So
life.
you would incorporate nukes as part of your explanation.
Actually, no. You mean the idea that nuclear weapons have kept the peace?
Yes.
I actually have a discussion of that in The Better Angels, summarized again in Enlightenment Now, and I am skeptical of that.
Yeah.
Actually.
Why is that?
One reason is that the conventional armies of the great powers were already so destructive that neither side was eager for a replay of World War II anytime soon. Just look at the destruction of World War II, where nukes played a very small role in it. The other is that because nuclear weapons are so ridiculously destructive, certainly strategic nuclear weapons, they've almost formed a different realm of hypothetical possibilities that has not so much effect on wars as they're carried out. There's a concept of a nuclear taboo that did not emerge suddenly, but probably after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where even the tactical nuclear weapons, whose destructive power is comparable to conventional weapons, no one wants, at least so far, let's hope it holds, no one goes there. There's been contrary to all predictions, no nuclear weapons used in war since Nagasaki. So they've always been taken off the table as a factor in wars. Even then, wars have declined, including often wars between a nuclear and a non-nuclear power, like Britain and Argentina over the Falklands. The generals in Argentina knew that Margaret Thatcher wasn't going to nuke Buenos Aires, and so they made the reckless move of trying to take over the Falklands. So that was a case where nuclear weapons should have deterred war and didn't. So I think we'll never know, but a reasonable conjecture is that the post-war period would have played out pretty much the same if nukes had never been invented.
What were some of the coolest or weirdest statistics that surprised you? I read one about an 88% decline in the likelihood of getting mowed down on the sidewalk.
That is right, yes. That surprised me.
Who was getting mowed down on the sidewalk 100 years ago?
Oh, well, I mean, people still get killed get hit by cars.
This is auto accidents.
Auto accidents, oh yeah. They're still a major cause of death, but it used to be much worse. People, I know there's an eminent neuroscientist, Patricia Goldman-Rakich, who was killed as a pedestrian when a car hit into her. My grandfather's sister was killed by a streetcar. So pedestrian deaths are not a trivial, there are far more pedestrian deaths than there are deaths from terrorism. But the number of pedestrian deaths has fallen by a factor of more than 90%. Number of people killed by bolt of lightning has fallen by more than 95%. That surprised me.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, a lot of it is that we're not farmers anymore, so we spend much less time out in the fields. But also our tractors are better insulated, our houses are better insulated.
Climate change? Although that might be
more the other direction.
So it's actually
even with climate change.
Yes, even with climate change, it's not. There's that sort of a decline.
But probably the most. I was surprised that we have so much more leisure time than people did 50 years ago because we all feel so crazy busy. Although professionals really are busier, but the average American or European has much more leisure time now than they did in the 1960s. For women, it flattened out. The reduction in time spent at work, or the amount of time gained in leisure. And the reason is that, here's a mind-blowing statistic, that single working women today spend more hours with their children than married stay-at-home moms did in the 1950s.
That is nuts.
So forget Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best.
What were they doing in the 1950s?
Oh, they were going
socializing,
to coffee clutches and playing mahjong, and they opened the door. I mean, this is the way I grew up. I didn't spend a huge number of hours having stories read to me by my mother.
I see.
She'd open the door. I'd kind of run out to play.
Yeah.
Then at 6 o'clock, she'd yell, "Stephen," and
You'd come back.
I'd come back for dinner.
I see.
Those days are for better or worse. Those days are
Right.
gone. And I'll give you one other
Yes.
mind-blowing statistic. And this I knew about before writing either book. Is that we've been getting smarter. There is a phenomenon called the Flynn Effect, discovered by
The IQ. Okay.
IQ scores have increased by 3 points a decade throughout the 20th century, and in every continent, in almost a linear progression. It's tailing off. Things that can't go on forever don't.
Yeah.
And the Flynn effect is ending in wealthy countries.
You don't want everybody to be a genius.
Well, I don't think that would be a terrible idea, but it's not going to happen. The reasons are not completely clear, but it's probably driven by the expansion of education and by the trickle-down of technical concepts, including abstract visual diagrams and symbols, into everyday life.
Yeah, because this sort of gets to the nature and nurture argument, which I know you've talked a lot about and written a lot about. But there is an element that nature will get you so far, and nurture can and has linearly, monotonically, has been increasing.
Well, and of course I wanted to explain the apparent discrepancy between the fact that intelligence is largely heritable and the fact that it's increased over time with the Flynn effect. The two resolutions are that even though intelligence is highly heritable, it's nowhere near 100% heritable.
Right.
And so even if it's, say, half the variation is genetic, well, half the variation isn't genetic. But also it turns out that if you do careful statistical analysis, the aspects of intelligence that have risen with the Flynn effect are not the aspects of intelligence that are most directly affected by the genes.
Really?
Which makes sense, yeah. So, for example, measures of raw brain power, like how many digits can you hold in memory and then repeat backwards, have not risen.
That's right.
But ability to do analogies, like bird is to egg as tree is to seed, that has risen significantly, as has the ability to decode complex visual diagrams.
Oh, interesting. Is there anything that, given all these, encouraging and positive statistics, what are the things that make you sad or worried or anxious or depressed about the world?
Certainly climate change, authoritarian populism, the rise of nationalism and fascism light in Hungary and Poland, and of course to some extent the United States. The improbable but catastrophic possibilities such as nuclear war. And I discuss each one of them in Enlightenment Now. I did not want to make it seem as if we have nothing to worry about. We do have things to worry about.
But it is generally still, the mood of the book is that, hey, things are not heading, again, generally over history, are not heading in as bad of a direction as we think they are.
Yes, to the extent that it doesn't happen by magic. There's no arc of improvement. There's no dialectic. It's human ingenuity being applied to make people better off. It's doctors trying to cure disease. It's politicians trying to avoid war. It's policy people trying to reduce crime. And the message is that if we apply our minds and our will to doing it, and if the goal is make people better off, we can eke out increments that build on each other.
We have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to just kind of quickly run through the major other parts of this book, which are it's not just say, look, life is again not heading in the direction that everybody says it's heading, or has been heading. You explain it, but there's also the reason. Two other things. One is why we don't recognize it, and second, what to do to preserve that. Why aren't people recognizing this?
Yeah, part of it is because the view of the world we get from journalism is
the media.
The media, although I don't want to attack the mainstream media because obviously they're much better than a lot of the alternatives.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything nefarious going on. But there is something about the inherent nature of journalism that is bound to mislead.
Yeah.
Journalism is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. And a lot of the good things in the world are things that don't happen, like wars, like entire countries that don't have terrorist attacks or don't have rampage shootings. There is definitely a negativity bias in the news media. That is.
But that's because that's what people click on, right? I mean, isn't that?
It's part of
human nature in the sense that that's what we want to kind of learn more about. We're risk averse. We
are loss averse. Although most journalists would say that they have a professional creed or ethic. That even though they've got to pay the bills, it's not just about getting the most clicks and eyeballs, but that they have a mission. But the problem is that often I don't think the mission is thought through carefully enough because the mission is equated with tearing down corruption and malfeasance and showing how everything is rotten and decadent. And of course, some things are rotten and decadent, and they have to be exposed. There is injustice, there is suffering. But if that's all that gets reported, then people can get a systematically erroneous view of the world, and it can play into the hands of radicals and demagogues who say, you can't walk down the street without getting shot, and our institutions are failing. We've got to drain the swamp. We've got to burn the empire to the ground. Only I can fix it. So it actually, by saying that our institutions are unredeemable, it plays into the hands of the worst kind of radicals.
But that's the pull, right? I mean, because you could also say, by people just freaking out about everything all the time, they're also, because we're risk averse and we're overweighting risk, we might be more likely to find solutions and drive toward progress precisely because we're not rationally analyzing the problem.
It's not clear that is the outcome. Now, obviously, we need information. We need a picture of what's going wrong, of who's suffering, of what can be fixed. But if it's too relentlessly negative, then the result is not necessarily engagement. It could be the exact opposite. It could be fatalism. It's like, the poor will always be with you. What difference does it make? Everything that's been tried has failed. It's just getting worse. Our institutions are any change is bound to be better than what we have now.
It could be complacency, on the other hand, though.
There could be complacency, indeed. So people have to know, and I think journalists are sensitive to the accusation that in earlier decades they were complicit with power structures. They were they glorified power, but they've gone so far to the other extreme that they've left people thinking that the institutions of liberal democracy and science and international cooperation are hopelessly moribund. And I think that leads to withdrawal and fatalism. Why bother voting? There's no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They both represent a corrupt system. Or just disengaging altogether, figuring I may as well enjoy my life and hope the experts are wrong.
So what do you hope people? I mean, I guess it's not exactly a call to action, but if there was something you wanted somebody to take away to say, okay, I should think about things differently, what would be that one?
A view of the world that's based more on data, on trends, on data sets that we calibrate. How
but data sets are aren't they subjective too? Or can't they be manipulated? They depend on definitions and.
Well, they can be, but not infinitely. I mean, you can lie with statistics, but on the other hand, you can recognize when people lie with statistics, and it's better than not having data and just making up stories. And there's no way that you can explain away the fact that there's been a crime decline. Analyze the murder statistics any way you want. It really goes down if you look at them at all. So it should be more fact-based, more data-based, more historically grounded. And by history, I don't even mean 200 years ago. I mean like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And people should have respect for the institutions that have made it possible. That for all their flaws, liberal democracy is better than anarchy. It's better than totalitarianism. That the United Nations is better than a world of zero-sum competition. That regulated markets are better than either totalitarian planned economies or complete anarcho-capitalism. That we've identified some things that work kind of okay, and okay is better than catastrophe, and more to the point, that are getting better, that have the ability to improve themselves and to lead to human improvement.
Well, I can cheers to human improvement for sure.
We'll drink to that.
Steve, thank you so much.
Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Aroop.
The book is called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. We had Dr. Steven Pinker, the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. Steve, thank you so much again for joining.
Thanks so much, Aroop. Thanks for having me.
Great.